Welcome to today's conference on Arts as Critique. My name is Natalia Bisuil, and I'm the director of the Arts Research Center, as well as a professor in the Department of Film and Media and Spanish and Portuguese. I particularly want to thank all of our speakers today, some of whom have come from very far to participate in this day-long conversation. Today's symposium, organized through the Arts Research Center, is part of this series of investigation. It's part of this series of investigation.
Sorry, we're turning the mic on really quick.
Okay, well, I don't need this. Right? Do I need this? No. Okay. I don't know if I would need it with the computer. Today's symposium, organized through the Arts Research Center, is part of this year's investigation. So let me begin by saying a few words about the Arts Research Center in general and about the broader set of programs and questions that today's presentations will be addressing. The Arts Research Center is, as many of you know, a laboratory for the arts at Berkeley, a space where professors, students, artists, curators, public intellectuals, and community members are involved in making and thinking about the arts from multiple practices, disciplines, and languages to question, among other things, the very limits and porosities of disciplines, the forms and powers of artistic languages, of writing from and about those languages, and the relationship between the arts and the world. When I accepted the invitation to direct the Arts Research Center this year, I thought that I wanted to work in a specific way and focus meetings, conversations, and events in specific geopolitical areas of the world. I wanted to work collaboratively for this to be a real laboratory about limits and porosities of disciplines. So I convened an interdisciplinary group with Annika Lenson, who is an assistant professor of art history and is here, everyone's here. Lee Radford, an associate professor of African American studies, Palomi Saha, an assistant professor of English, and Tariq El-Haik, an associate professor of anthropology. From the space of collaboration and conversation, I invited us to think whether the ways in which the arts and thinking and writing about the arts was or not a critical form of politics. By political, I meant not the sphere of governance nor politics per se, of course, but art and criticism's intervention into the symbolic universe, the universe of the collective unconscious, to undo the broken structures of this world and replace them with new, emerging, formless forms for a future. Art and criticism are political insofar as they engage the symbolic order to imagine and create new languages and new forms. I also wanted the discussions and guests of the year to help us reflect on the world from a very specific place, as I said, the South, understood as a broad geographical area, including Latin America, Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, but also primarily as a political zone constituted and marked by exclusion, marginalization, effacement, and violence through the long history of colonialism, capitalism, and the notions of modernity, historicity, and progress that the West produced on and through the bodies and societies of those regions. I wanted us to investigate the creative powers of the South, the power and imagination from that South, the source of a politics for a possible future, which would be critical, yet not utopian, but real, concrete, and possible. The Arts Research Center's year-long program has sought to prompt anew the question of the relationship, therefore, of art and the political. We have explored art and the work of the critic as a mode of political performativity and embodied critical engagement with the geopolitics of injustice, normalized anesthesia, fascism, destructive violences of displacement and occupation, as well as contemporary forms of dissent, protest, and the articulations of democracy. Within this larger framework, today's conference engages the rather simple yet complex question of the relationship between art, technology, criticism, and the social and political exigencies of our times. It attempts to address the transformative capacity of art criticism, and arts organizations to inscribe and mobilize collective imaginaries and struggles contesting domination. This entails thinking of the relationship between art and futurity, between art and the environment, between art, technology, and the human, between art and the institutions and circuits that seek to destroy or help sustain its critical capacity. Historically, the idea of arts as critique has been both generative and fraught. We know that art cannot provide alternative to today's advanced capitalist politics, nor articulate concrete emancipatory paths for social movements. Yet many of us wish for art's potential political agency. We want art to be a tool for fighting back, to be one of the agents thinking other worlds, making other worlds. Most recently, since the early 1990s, writers, filmmakers, artists, and critics have engaged exponentially in participation, collaboration, in search of forms of social engagement, community building, politicized actions, critique, and militancy. If this form of aesthetic intervention has existed way before the 1990s, the orientation towards social practice has grown exponentially in the last decades. Some critics have called this a social turn in the arts, others a political turn in culture and criticism writ large. This turn of art and criticism towards the world and its problems is not a turn, but a return to previous historical attempts at engaging the crisis of its time. The return to a similar past gesture does not signal that the social and political turn, just to continue using that, has been a failure in the past, and that the present-day turn is an attempt to get it right once and for all. It rather signals that art and criticism have always and will always face the world, critically imagining futures. Art cannot change the world itself, but it can change our relation to the world, to injustice, to the possible futures, to the damaging past, and more importantly, it can form new relations among each other that activate our political potential for social transformation. And I wanted to say that today's conference, in a way, is a second iteration of this conference, which happened in Mexico City in late August, early September of last year, under another kind of umbrella, institutionally speaking, not so much the Arts Research Center, even though the idea had been housed here, but through the Mellon Foundation in an exploratory workshop we convened in Mexico City. So I want to thank, this is that one of thanking, all our co-sponsors for today. Generosity has made this gathering possible. The UCHRI, the University of California Humanities Research Institute grant that we got, the Townsend Center for Humanities, the Center for Latin American Studies, the Center for New Media, the D-Lab, the Department of Art History Mellon Curatorial Initiative, and the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. And I also want to thank very, very especially Lauren Pearson and Lori Mesquite, that many of you have been in contact with, who are really the backbones of the Arts Research Center. I really don't do anything, and they do everything. And I would not even be able to do the little that I do were it not for them. So today's event is really the hard work of both of them. So let's give them a round. I think everyone has a copy of the program. If you don't, there's some outside. And the focus of today really is conversation. So except for the last panel, which takes a slightly different shape, where we will have two curators, the curator from an independent art space in Colombia and the curator from an independent art space in Senegal, talking about their projects. The first three panels only have one presentation, which makes it a little bit of a strange panel, right? Because we're used to thinking of a panel as having multiple people in them. But I continue calling it a panel because there will be a respondent to each presentation that will hopefully help us get into a kind of intense debate around the presentation itself. So the commentators or discussers will present the panelists, but I'm not going to present it all the time. And there will be plenty of breaks throughout the day. And there is also, we are going to close today's symposium or conference with some very exciting poetry and performance. So please stay for that in the later afternoon. Thank you.
introduction is very brief and point you to the biographies that are in the programs. What our first panel is Future Remake on the Uses and Abuses of Representation of Life, presented by Professor Daria Alhait, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology at UC Davis, and Chris Rovetto, Professor at Cinema and Digital Media and Science and Technology at UC Davis.
We realized that we came here with some ancient technology. Now, the idea of this was originally to have two images projected at once, and we only have one computer old enough to project the images that we had originally scanned. So sadly, you're going to see one image after the other, and that was not what was originally meant. But my computer of a generation ago no longer works, so we couldn't get it to
read the DVD. Okay. So first of all, I'd like to thank Natalia for the invitation to invite me to collaborate on this year's lecture series and to invite us to present our collaborative project. And again, also heartfelt gratitude to Laura and Lori for all of their help. So, a very quick word about the title. So, Future Remake, and then the subtitle on the use and abuse of representation for life. Representation can be substituted by identity, by the cultural, and so on. And we will be articulating some of this during our presentation. Future Remake is a two-channel performance lecture with cinematic moving images and a response to the Traveling Communique project that was framed in 2014 for an exhibit and lecture series in the Museum of Yugoslav History in Belgrade, Serbia. The project was framed to us as, quote, that the idea that the collective statements, images, and sounds announced during the first conference of the non-aligned movement in Belgrade in September 1961 are still traveling with us, end quote. However, the Belgrade Collective also asked us to consider the following question: who is the addressee of the communique today?
So we responded, they'd asked us to think about the purloined letter and the con. So they had basically tried to think about materials that the museum had received and made public. A lot of materials from the non-aligned movement, but also Tito's archive. And they wanted us to think about this as a purloined letter. According to Jacques Lacan, the letter, a form of communique, travels, but it travels in a circuitous manner. Through displacement, a sequence of appropriation that changes hands, never to reveal its contents, only a set of relations between trickery, mimicry, and repetition. Taking cue from Traveling Communique's invitation to reflect on the cartographies and repetitions traced by the travels of a purloined letter, a purloined communique, Future Remake is an assemblage that offers itself as an antidote to the contemporary visual, political, curatorial, and media culture that ails from overinvestment in a fundamentally humanist drive towards iconicity and impoverished repetitions.
We take as a starting point two complementary but entangled terms, the anthropological term and the documentary impulse. From the 1990s on, third cinemas, regional cinemas, indigenous media, and ethnographic films have been reanimated. These reanimations have intensified under the impetus of curatorial platforms, such as the one curated by Enwezor, Documenta 11's postcolonial constellations, the 2017 Venice Biennial titled Viva Arte Viva, that celebrated humanism as an, quote, act of resistance, of liberation, and of generosity, end quote. But also La Triennale, Intense Proximity, also curated by Enwezor at the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, as well as the curatorial statement for the exhibition Soulèvement, or Uprising at the Jeu de Paume in Paris, the Paume being the iconic historical building during the French Revolution, where the philosopher, art historian, and curator Georges Didou-Berman notes, quote, after Spinoza, Freud taught us that man's desires are indestructible. Rising up is therefore a hope, an imagining, a reaching into the future,
However, these returns and resurrections have often been hinged on a problematic set of distinctions that continue to haunt our conceptualization of political cinemas and intermedial politics. Among these terms, we isolate the vexing distinction between, on the one hand, the figures of the activists, the indigenous, the figure of the intellectual, and on the other, a distinction often bridged through either Gramsci's notion of an organic intellectual or through the abuses of Foucault's complex notion of philosophical militantism. In the history of political cinema, philosophical militantism has been particularly pronounced in the work of Glaber and Jean-Luc Godard, who often referred to their internationalist cinema politics as tricontinentalism. To be sure, for intellectual filmmakers like Godard and Rocha, tricontinentalism was framed beyond mere geographic and historical terms, something akin to a soul, specific to the cinematic apparatus, what Gilles Deleuze once called the spiritual automaton. In light of this, the heritage of the tricontinental cinema and militant anthropology begins to look like a Francis Bacon triptych, in which all of the residual trace of organicism has been wiped out.
Both terms, the anthropological turn and the documentary turn, we argue, give impetus for the aesthetic regime that provides a new perspective on the displacement of radical politics in the realm of aesthetics, only to return to past forms of radical politics that end up displacing them by aestheticizing them. But rather than read displacement as a form of aletheia, a play of truth as Lacan does, we are interested in reading displacement as another form of repetition. By thinking through and thinking with iconic images and text, we explore how curatorial thought in the so-called aesthetic regime of art curation has remade a set of relations between artists, art history, cultural history, politics, ethics, spectatorship, and curatorship. This aesthetic regime has branded itself with various forms of political militancy. One such brand, perhaps the most well-articulated one, aesthetically at least, is the militant image of Kodjo Eshun and Rose Gray, who offered another response to traveling communique, one that directly connected the non-aligned movement to tricontinental politics and third cinema, most notably associated with Fernando Solanas and Octavio Latino, Gabriel Espinosa, Usman Samben, Jorge Sanjines, Kidlat Tahimik, Alvarado Alvarez, Sulaiman Sisse, Gillo Pontecorvo, Patricio Guzman, and Miguel Litin.
Instead, what we call the cinematic art of non-alignment, we see as another response, one that does not return to the accursed share of the aesthetic politics of cinema action or cinema engagé, that infuses art with historical forms of solidarity. Eshun and Gray argue that the past lives on in an inherited effect, and therefore they believe that, quote, the reanimation of militancy in contemporary artistic compositions and configurations, often emerging from the informal and institutional spaces of contemporary art, answers to a demand to reread the present from the perspective of a past that persists into the contemporary world and necessarily reconfigures its relation to history. To call it an inherited effect, as Gray and Eshun do, is problematic, as these solidarities can and should be framed beyond ontologically determined political forms, as well as beyond the enthusiastic rituals of national communitas or the commons we have grown accustomed to through decades of official and militant nationalist pedagogy and in sentimental education.
We, of course, realize that after the 2016 elections in the UK with the Brexit vote, in the US with the election of Trump, and a continuing movement to the right in Europe, or Brazil's neo-fascist turn, this call to militancy or this call to resistance is even more urgent. Yet, we have to be careful not to establish an isomorphic relation between political history and art and film history. We ought perhaps to be careful about creating relations of equivalency where the currency of militancy is converted into an exchange value that generates cultural capital in the curatorial art market. The untimeliness of the contemporary demands from us something other than a mode of curation that trades in what Ray and Oshun have called inherited effects. As in a veritable montage, our proposed reanimation of cinematic moving images functioned as a counterpoint to what Gray and Oshun have poetically and affectionately, albeit perhaps too optimistically, called the cine-geographies of the militant image. Our assemblage of moving images exceeds the figurative impulse of these rather remedial, curative cine-geographies. Cine-geography, in this sense, taps into a pre-existing set of collaborations, a rereading of a past-future notion of the tricontinental that is stuck in a loop between 1955 and 1966, waiting to be cured of its political malaise. So by 1955, of course, I'm referring to Bandung with its 10-point statement leading to the non-aligned movement. 1956 and 1959, I refer to the first two congresses of black artists and writers in Paris and then in Rome. These are often referred to as the second Bandung. The second Congress of black artists and writers is particularly well known for having François Fanon to have delivered the inaugural speech, and the inaugural speech that will become the chapter on national culture in his Reich of the Earth. And 1961, the first non-aligned conference in Belgrade. 1966, the Tricontinental Conference in Havana, where on January 15, Fidel Castro gave the conference's closing speech at Havana's Cinema Charles Chaplin, the venue of the Cinematheca of Cuba. After speaking at length in support of the anti-imperialist struggles of the Vietnamese, after saluting the Moroccan socialist leader who had just been kidnapped and killed, Ben Barka, he closed the conference with these words, quote, "Our country, which, as you have been able to see, is made up of various ethnic groups, a result of the intermingling of people from the various continents, deeply linked to Latin America because of these facts, deeply linked with Africa, deeply linked to all of the people from all continents, has done its utmost to make pleasant the state of the delegation that we hosted here. They bid them farewell with an embrace, as a symbol of their sentiments of fraternity and solidarity towards the other people who struggle, and for whom they are ready also to offer, they're ready to offer their blood. Fatherland or death, venceremos, we will win." Back in 1956, while he still wavered between Paris and the United States, a year before he returned to join the civil rights movement, James Baldwin attended the Congress of Black Writers and Artists at the Sorbonne as an observer. Richard Wright and Aimé Césaire were both there, along with many other lucid voices of the decolonizing era. Alioune Diop, co-organizer of the conference and the founder and editor of Présence Africaine, the journal, called it the second Bandung. The event anticipated the emergence of the tricontinental. Césaire spoke of the necessity for colonized and decolonizing nations to affirm their cultural differentiations from Europe, and the audience thronged around him to shake his hand and kiss him. Baldwin, however, recoiled in ambivalence. Quote, "I myself felt stirred in a very strange and disagreeable way, for Césaire's case against Europe, which was watertight, was also a very easy case to make. He had certainly played very skillfully on their emotions and their hopes, but he had not raised the central, tremendous question, which was simply, what had this colonial experience made of them, and what were they now to do with it? For they were all, now, whether they liked it or not, related to Europe, stained by European visions and standards. He had penetrated into the heart of the great wilderness which was Europe, and stolen the sacred fire. And this, which was the promise of their freedom, was also the assurance of his power." End quote.
In the spirit of this ambivalence toward decolonial and postcolonial obsessions with centers and peripheries, cities and provinces, as well as toward liberal, postnational, and cosmopolitan pieties that continue to circulate, we take up Baldwin's suggestion of non-alignment. We propose a mode of creative geography, a non-aligned geography, perhaps a non-alignment suggesting exceeds historical tricontinentalism, with its vertical parade of rivers on the one hand, and on the other horizontal and equally nationalist militantism, with its seductively designed slogans and moralist overtones that could not be dissipated by its genuinely sincere poetry. Unlike the synergiographies of the militant image and their narrative trajectories, leading us to a speculative future of the past, our juxtaposition of landscapes, people, time images, recollection images, music, and cultural references creates a sense of ambiguity and uncertainty that does not amount to a unified subject that can be classified as the multitude or hybridity. These filmmakers give us neither a past nor a future, but a series of possible poetic connections to recognize or identify plurality, heterogeneity, or the multitude as a force of resistance would simply presuppose an affinity between opposition, morality, and truth, whether it is primordial or future-oriented. But it also would constitute what Deleuze calls future-oriented, quote, eternally blessed, unspecified internal object, unquote, whether in the form of Oedipus, repression, free-market capitalism, communism, socialism, or Tea Party Christianism. There is nothing new about these ideologies based on a promised future or an irretrievable past. As Deleuze puts it, quote, for the new, in other words, difference, calls forth forces in thought, which are not the forces of recognition today or tomorrow, but the powers of a completely other model, from an unrecognized and unrecognizable terra incognita, end quote. Through these looped moving images extracted from the work of Glauber Rocha, Delmer Zilnik, Dusan Makaveyev, Sergei Eisenstein, Ruben Gámez, to name only a few, we hope to open a space of a radical visual critique and clinique that unmoors the preset loops we have constructed, the ones that simply shuttle between iconicity and aniconicity, between affect, icon, and their symbolic programming, as an antidote against the iterative assemblages of contemporary culture. These film artists denounce the neorealist as well as Marxist nostalgia or romantic desire for a heroic and moral proletariat or peasantry, and a neo-decadent nostalgia for aestheticism. It is important to examine their cinematic strategy, its endless dissimulation, which draws us into its disruption of authoritative gestures. It at the same time forces us to recognize that this enframing will be unable to escape from the rhetorical deceit it denounces. These looped clips and iconic images are assembled and performed through a bricolage that calls forth the chaotic intensity of what Tourette calls incurable images, such as those found in Glauber Rocha's Claro, Piercarlo Pasolini's Arabia, Sergei Eisenstein's Que Viva Mexico, and Ruben Gámez's Ideas.
But our examples are not just historical, nor are they necessarily from the film canon. They are cinematic in the sense of expanded cinema and intermedia practice. For instance, in Lebanese artist Rabeh Amroue's installation With Blood, With Soul, there is an enigmatic spectator that digitally withdraws from a militant's funeral. Or in the installation by the Colombian artist Carlos Castro, in which a statue of Simón Bolívar is cannibalized by pigeons. Or again, the iconic scenes from Angelopoulos' Ulysses Gaze, in which Lenin's statue is transported up the Danube and back to Germany. Or in Raúl Ruiz's Le Don, which is a short film inspired by Marcel Mauss's essay on the gift, that asks us to rethink the relationship of anthropology to the gift of cinema. Or again, in the opening scene from Tarek Peguia's Inland, in which revolutionary militants acrimoniously debate the role of the intellectual in Algeria. In all of these films and media artworks, the tricontinental soul reappears as a tension between participation to and withdrawal from contemporary visual culture's militant tendency toward iconicity. The very repetition and juxtaposition of moving images explodes the iconicity that attempts to pacify them. But such repeated acts of juxtaposition do not amount to either a form of emancipation of the spectator as a new political subject, nor do they return us to a dialectical model of synthesis. The repetition of images, phrases, sounds, and citations produces thought as what Chris would call an uncanny aesthetics, the recognition of repetition and return. But rather than thinking through images, this type of cinematic critique requires that we consider the assumptions these various relations are making.
We had originally imagined our piece as a two-channel installation and an exhibition for three main reasons. The first is to reflect on what film historians still maintain as cinema's two or double tendencies, and its double origin as, on the one hand, a mimetic art form that has the potential to capture the real. This tendency is usually exemplified by the Lumiere brothers' early films, which are called actualités. Catherine Russell has called their short films documentaries avant la lettre. On the other hand, we have the tradition of Méliès, his trick films that experimented with the cinematic apparatus and invented stop motion, double exposure, masking, and parallel montage. Although the innovative techniques of Méliès have been incorporated into the realist or documentary tradition of cinema, this articulation between realism, the immediacy of witnessing or believing in images, and escapism, the cinema of attractions, continued to manifest itself, as in, for example, the German expressionist film was confronted with or countered with new objectivity movement. Soviet montage cinema battled between the Kino Pravda and the cinema truth of Ziegler Vertov, the lyrical realism of Alexander Dulchenko, and the intellectual montage or dialectics of Sergei Eisenstein. Neorealism, Cine Novo, and Third Cinema would appropriate aesthetics of new objectivity to focus on poverty and street and urban rural life, the typage of Eisenstein, and the newsreel footage aesthetic to create a reality effect. And on the other hand, we have the poetics of the apparatus, its non-human and even inhuman capabilities to generate dematerialized experiences and modes of affection, akin to ex-mind photolini, or the spiritual automaton of Deleuze. But the question remained, is the cinematic apparatus a disinterested observer or a biased imperial or imperial way of seeing?
The second reason is that cinema, like photography, has always been considered a bastard of the arts, since it was seen as simply copying reality. That is, cinema is a reproduction of the natural world, or the real in cinema is the false reproduction that we come to believe in. Furthermore, as a copy or index, and non-art, cinema displaces the artist as a central figure, until, of course, the arrival of auteur cinema. But even with the arrival of auteur cinema, as Vertov's famous film shows us, is primarily cyborgian and cybernetic, not humanist. For example, if we think about the moving image in digital format, we have to remember that optical data flows consist of high frequencies that require exponential magnification of processing capabilities. Real-time optical signal processing requires an immense amount of storage and computing power. These processes are often masked by the image.
So the third reason is we want to emphasize that cinema, as André Bazin argued, is the art of time. It is always a future remake. Cinema reanimates or brings the past back to life, confusing the sense of the past and the experience of presence. Bazin points out the photographic tendency embalms time, rescuing it simply from its proper corruption. That is, our experience of time is subject to forgetting, but the recorded image of time preserves every detail, replacing our memory with the image caught in time. Cinema, like photography, is considered indexical, but an index is also a double. It is both a trace and an imprint, implying not only a connection between subject and object, but making it difficult to distinguish one from the other. Roland Barthes points out that the index is also a shifter. The moving image is both here and there, and is this and that, and now and then. It is this instability that gives rise to the cinematic uncanny, a sense of familiarity that is defamiliarizing, or what Maxime Gorky called being immersed in the kingdom of shadows, which he described as being able to watch the gray ghost of one's image as if it had its own life. Cinema appears to have divergent histories, trajectories, and geographies that recycle the same lines on a well-worn map. Between what we recognize as first cinema, one that endlessly rehearses the opposition between what is fiction or escapist film, and here we include Bollywood, telenovelas to first cinema, which was exclusively associated in the past with Hollywood. As markets expand and move into the global economy, so do these imagined geographies. Europe may no longer be the site of second cinema, but Godard's famous dictum about the critique from within still applies to this ever more global second cinema, relabeled again as global, world cinema, or even independent cinema. This is a cinema that cannot be anything more than critique, as if critique was not enough. And now political cinema has moved from its strata among the third world to the global south, still borrowing attributes mainly from Italian neorealism with non-professional actors shooting on location, collaboratively produced and created, episodic in structure and essayistic in style, and it still is deeply sympathetic to the politics of the disenfranchised. This is what we have come to expect from militant cinema, a cinema that both reproduces the stratified geography and re-territorializes political cinema. It is therefore problematic to equate the former with the latter. We would like to argue that non-aligned cinema also has different legacies and trajectories. There is no traveling communique, no purloined letter, only the politics of assemblage and reassemblage. The image cannot be faithful to any political context. The same images that once moved us to tears, to take arms, are the ones that are for sale at the Gap.
The first is the one associated with Fernando Solanas and Octavio Latino. They articulate what they call third, subversive or guerrilla cinema as, quote, the cinema of the revolution is at the same time one of destruction and construction. Destruction of the image that neocolonialism has created of itself and of us, and construction of a throbbing, living reality which recaptures truth in any of its expressions, end quote. Yet, this is not a destruction in the Nietzschean sense. As Nietzsche points out, quote, everything which is good and beautiful depends upon illusion. Truth kills, indeed kills itself insofar it realizes its own foundation in error, end quote. Thus, all art or critical truth must also be self-destructive. It is exhausted once truth is used for the purposes of propaganda or for the legitimation of power. This is not what Lacan proposes with the purloined communique or letter. Truth does not simply become lie, but rather an unstable construct that, in order to sustain itself, must always confront other truths, images, forms of rhetorical invention, and potential usages. Like myth, truth is contaminated by the very act of being attributed to specific events, concepts, or images.
According to Sergio Garcia, quote, political cinema has become a cinema of propaganda, end quote, that lacks both an interest in and an awareness of its own aesthetics. At the same time, Peter Rowland puts it, quote, political militancy in itself is not any guarantee of being avant-garde, end quote. Similarly, Garcia Espinosa argued in the journal Respuesta, third cinema, as imperfect cinema, does not mean a carelessly or poorly done cinema. We are not to blame if someone has justified his or her ineptitude on us. Even if counter cinema attempts to downplay its own aesthetic choices, its adherence to realist aesthetics, it does not cease to be aesthetic. This returns us to another infamous problem outlined by Walter Benjamin in his Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproducibility. Here Benjamin attempts to distinguish between the politics of aesthetics, which he attributes to Nazism, and the aesthetics of politics that he identifies with Soviet Dada and Surrealist film, which has been rehearsed and reversed once again by Jacques Rancière in his malaise of aesthetics, or aesthetic malaise. Rancière separates the regime of aesthetics from politics and ethics, and opposes the type of aesthetic politics that makes decisions on people, for the people, instead of emancipating the people for the spectator.
Any art that offers a political truth or a critical perspective is only propaganda. Yet it is not clear what an emancipated cinema could be. Is it emancipated from the apparatus, from ideology, from ideas, from the human subject, or from modes of identification? With our proposed non-aligned cinema, mode of curation, and assemblage work, we want to suggest that the left's old fights have become exhausted and indeed exhausting. Non-aligned cinema offers a counterpoint to historical non-alignment, historical tricontinentalism, and purloined communiques, holding perhaps the promise of something left within the left.
Thank you for that. So I've actually put together a set of questions that I hope will actually be provocations for a shared discussion. I certainly cannot fully take on the many things that you've given us in this great presentation. But I want to start by taking up this question with which you start, which is the question of who does the communique speak to now? So take up the question of the audience and time. And I'm deeply convinced by your argument for displacement as a kind of repetition, for us to think against equivalence, but to find other ways of reaching across. But I might ask first, what is the time of the kind of cinematic curation that you're suggesting? Is this an aesthetics of what we might call a future anterior, in which it will have been that? Because certainly, it's one of the ways in which a contemporary conception of the left conceives of the non-aligned movement, right? Now, Bandung is so hot right now. Everyone's so interested in returning to Bandung. But it has this sort of weak messianism, right? Where it is in the return to Bandung now that it will have been that the politics of the non-aligned movement have come to pass. And so I'm wondering if that is the kind of weak messianic force of this curatorial practice too. And I found myself in both watching and listening, and then also having read your piece before, thinking a lot about Marx and Benjamin, and unfortunately also Derrida.
Fortunately, we're happy with
because I think that there is something really rich there in your resistance to inherited effects. That inheritance is a kind of false promise. And you seem to want to push us away from inheritance and the expectations of inheritance towards a repetitive loop. But is this a psychoanalytic repetitive loop? Also maybe a reparative loop, which is repetition with a difference? And what is the difference? What are we to, is there a kind of pedagogical difference? Is there an emancipatory difference? And so I'm interested in what is the sort of time of this? What is the, if not inheritance, what is the takeaway? Are we supposed to carry anything with us from this loop that you're suggesting? The other question I have is, I'm fully on board that there is something other than nostalgia that we might be turning to. And I'm wondering though then, if it's not nostalgia, what in the future remade is to come, right? What can come from that which is made again? What is it that we are supposed to be looking to? What is it that we are not supposed to be looking back towards? Is there somewhere a deeply utopian vision, even as you seem to be warning us away from it, that seems to emerge in this particular curatorial practice? It seems that part of this comes up in the several versions of directions that you give us. You give us revolution, repetition, and some of them are ones that you are critiquing, and some seem to be more productive. But we also have trajectory, we have futurity, we have the loop, we have what is recycled, what is returned, but what is displaced. And I'm wondering what brings them together. Is, as you talk about the well-worn lines of a map, is there a kind of direction that we're following? Are you offering us a particular cartography? Is this one that is recognizable to us in terms of this these directions. Because it seems to me that fundamentally we're back to this Benjaminian sense of a weak messianism in which we're turned to the future no less than the past, right? This heterogeneous, disjointed time. So is this a curatorial practice as an atemporal event, right? Is that what the moment, the time of this practice might be? In which case, it would seem to me that the communique speaks now, as in 2014, as in 1961, to those who are not there. But also, in the case of your argument, I think maybe not necessarily to a future to come. So if it is neither to those who are not there and not to a future to come, to whom and to what time might it speak? So these are, I have many other questions, but I'll start with that kind of set of thoughts, and hopefully you can open it up.
That's great. Do you want to start with your curatorial?
Okay, first of all, I want to thank you for your comments. I think they are pertinent, and certainly you are, you've zoomed in on the kernel of our argument. So one, I would start just with an anecdote. That I want to take you back to Belgrade, and in 2014, and we are giving this lecture performance, and this is really the theater where Tito was
Is still.
Is still, yeah,
very
exactly.
right next to her.
And then we noticed that the Indonesian ambassador is in the audience. So to go back to Bandung, right? And my initial reaction at least was that this was amusing. It was troubling. So you are right that that 1955 is back in fashion, okay, and highly problematic. So there is here an analogy that our hosts in Belgrade were creating between figure of diplomacy and figure of curatorial practice, right? And I think in addition to the social turn, there's also a diplomatic turn in curatorial practice. So this idea of Ben Barka and Fanon and all of the male leaders of the 1960s of the decolonization era traveling together as delegation has been a motif that has been reappropriated by contemporary curators, right? And I think we are critical of that particular analogical model. Okay, so that's one way of putting it. The second way of answering the question about the time of this curatorial practice is to understand what is the etymological register of the term curation itself, right? So the way I read that particular word, I read it medically and clinically. So it has a medical register, cure. It has an ethical register, care. It has a theological register, curé in French means priest, or curate. It has also the register that we are interested in, which is in Italian, accurati means editing. So it's close to montage, right? So, and then my contribution to this conversation about curatorial practice has been to produce or create a concept in the sense of which I call the incurable, or the incurable. How can we create the incurable? Being aware of the medical, ethical, and theological register of the term curation. Is there a curatorial malaise that we are diagnosticating, right? Or that we are diagnosing but without a set of prescriptions. So that answers one to your question. It's a form of diagnosis. Curation is a form of diagnosis, but it's a non-prescriptive form of diagnosis. So that's point 2. Point 3 is Baldwin sitting in the audience in 1956 and not identifying with with the subject that he allegedly should be identifying with. And that ends up in a beautiful text called Princes and Powers, which we quote in our text. So that's one way to answer the question.
And formally speaking, which we apologize for not actually being able to provide today, we were supposed to have 2 images that were, one is commenting on the second one. And so when you see them next to each other, whenever you see an image that's cited another film or something, you recognize it as a kind of iconic other image. When you see them next to each other, there's something different that takes place. You can actually see the one sort of commenting simultaneously. So we're sort of interested in that kind of editing practice that has more to do with sort of undoing the iconicity of the one at the same time that it's still there. And that was sort of more of an experiment that we tried to put forward, rather than sort of thinking that that image would go forward, to show that that image is always been recycled. And in that sense, it's unstable. So we want to sort of point to the instability rather than it can be inherited and has a promise to it, as you pointed out.
This is fascinating. So I come from a very different disciplinary background, and one of the things that's now sort of preoccupying literary studies is this descriptive term.
Right.
And surface reading. And I'm wondering, when you said that part of, in describing this, in diagnosing curatorial malaise, that it's a prescriptive diagnosis. It's not a prescriptive diagnosis. I'm wondering, is it a descriptive diagnosis? Is there something about the work, and I don't know that description is the right term for cinema here, but is there a kind of work of commentary that happens, that is on the surface, that is about the side-by-side, that is something beyond the prescriptive?
Yes, I mean, I certainly wouldn't go to say that the descriptive is neutral, coming from thinking of the descriptive that has its own sort of politics to it. So, and I see cinema and the image outside of that kind of description. And that's why we sort of pointed out that, the images are appropriated all the time for things that they have nothing to do with, per se. And so, in that sense, there's something a little bit outside of the notion of what can be described and held to a particular type of context.
And also I would like to add that we take the term bricolage from anthropology and from Lévi-Strauss. And that term has a very interesting trajectory, which leads all the way to Paul Rabino's notion of assemblage work. So there is here a certain understanding of curation as a form of bricolage, or as a kind of assemblage work, which means that we are not starting from a tabula rasa. We are starting from a set of images that we are not inheriting, but we are starting with a set of images that we are diagnosing from a second order observation. So we are recurating the work of curators who have been seduced by this diplomatic term within contemporary art. So it's observing the observer, right? It's a form of participant observation. And it has an understanding of cinema that, some of the films that we are including as fragments, we do have problems with some of these films. We are not here just celebrating all of these filmmakers. It's by putting them together where something, I think, emerges that could perhaps release the difference that you've been asking us to talk about. But I insist that that difference is not cultural difference. That difference is another kind of difference that cannot be anchored within an imagined community, right? Whereas the curators whose work we are diagnosing begin with Benedict Anderson and begin with a certain understanding that geophilosophy is a partitioning of the world in imagined communities, whereas geophilosophy is precisely the dematerialization of that particular configuration of images and visual cultures.
I think certainly pointing to the violence of equivalency and seeking equivalency is, I think that's a wonderful way to think about. There's a different politics, but I wonder, is it still a utopian politics? Is it possible to have a utopian politics that does away with equivalency and in fact is looking for these sites of disjuncture, these sites of rupture where something fails, where something gets caught in the loop and something else falls out of it?
He's forcing me to answer this one. So I think the loop was a way of us sort of being able to show how some images do get caught up in this. And yet they don't have that promised future, the future to come in the Derridian sense. They might have had a past, but it's not necessarily a past that people recognize or read anymore. So that's the looping that we were interested in. I don't know if you want to call that utopian. We certainly are both, I speak for Beck too, interested in the project of racism and critique, and I don't know if you want to call that utopian.
But in the sense, I mean, since you brought the word utopian to the picture, I would say, in almost simplistic terms, it is heterotopian in the sense that we are searching for venues in which we can have the kind of conversations that we are having now. So this is a project that's imagined not only as a 2-channel lecture performance, it is also going to be a kind of counter-exhibition or counterpoint to Didier Berman's exhibition. It's been touring, went from Paris to Mexico City to, have you seen the one in Mexico City? And then to Buenos Aires as well, right? Brazil too, yeah. So we are, in this sense, actualizing our own critique of these diplomatic terms in various venues within the contemporary art world, within academic art venues and so on.
And these are images. Most of the ones that we showed on the first one have been reused over and over again, and most recently have resurfaced, and it sort of goes to the aspect that they've been remade. So these are the ones that have been projected over and over again. You just moved to the.
So I wonder if with this, the possibility that you're raising, the critique is utopian or heterotopian, maybe we'll take this as an opportunity to open up. We have about half an hour for shared discussion. This may be a good moment to turn heterotopically.
Thank you so much for the incredible performance. I wondered something in a way very simple. Is this kind of loop, this kind of project only possible with the moving image? Is there something specific to the moving image?
I think we both thought of it in terms of moving images, so that's a difficult question. We did also have still images with it, and I think that they work probably along with each other. I mean, if we think of Judy Uberman's the Palais de Tokyo, his other exhibit that was a remaking of Warburg's. So he had still images next to the moving images. Often they do work. I mean, obviously we think of Lenin, we don't necessarily think of Lenin as a moving image per se, because they're not much in terms of moving images of Lenin. So I think that when you talk about film, there's always a still image in there. And there's that stillness that we tend to think of when we recognize those images as well, because when we recognize them, we automatically sort of capture them and put them in some type of context, which is sort of making them not move. But the interest there was to really show that they are on the move. So I think there is something about the moving image that is a little bit different in the sense that it does point to an instability. I mean, even if you look back at the Hour of the Furnaces, if you're forced to look at the still image of the face of dead Geballe, the image changes because you've been watching it for 3.5 minutes. And your relationship to it is supposed to change. So we are interested also in that.
And there are various sections from our exhibition catalog essay, right, that we have not included, in our paper today nor in our presentation. But I think that the question of reanimation is certainly crucial to us, and the question of reanimation and the understanding that cinema is what Deleuze and the whole tradition of film theorists and film philosophers have referred to as the spiritual automaton, by which we mean this is a this-worldly understanding of the soul, to be sure, we are interested also in creating parallels between the dematerialization that was inaugurated with the advent of conceptual art in particular, and the parallel with cinema. So we are not professional curators per se, although we have curated a program. We are just wondering whether there is in fact, something quite interesting. If you think about the advent of the discipline of anthropology and the advent of psychoanalysis and the advent of anthropology in the late 19th century, there is kind of almost a co-evolution between these three great apparati of dispositif of modernity. I think we're just wondering whether creating parallels to be between the cinematic, the anthropological, not the psychoanalytical in our case, but with something of the order of anima, right? Something of the order of reanimating something that endures, but that endures not as an inherited effect. It endures in ways that are of the order of almost chance encounters with particular artists, or gaps between two moving images, and so on, or intervals, I guess, would be the more accurate term. And there is the notion of encounter here, and in this sense, it is a politics of friendship also. This is building with friends, philosophical friends, filmmaker friends, something that we have no guideline for.
I have a question from a philosophical friend.
Thanks very much. I came in a little bit late, so I may have missed this. And also, there were so many threads and leads, which is brought out and made interesting questions and comments on. But, so my comment, question, statement is very simple also. Can anyone do this? Or are you curatorial auteur?
I think anyone can do this.
And do we do it all the time, or
Well,
is that where the future and liberation comes from?
So I think we might have moments of doing this, but often we do get hooked on particular images and in a way that, we might say is unhealthy. In that sense that we try to ground something on an image, which that is, at least in my mind, the most problematic, because I think that the images are very unstable. And also, if we think about them in relationship to the past, they make the past unstable as well. And that's sort of this ghostly aspect that might be enduring, is the fact that the past isn't enduring, but there's something else that might be enduring, and that might be our relationship to, or our affinity always to particular types of images. But I do think there are moments when we do experience a kind of disjunction with some of the things that we didn't get attached to. We see them out of context, or we see them in a different context that upsets us. So we can sort of experience that disjunctedness.
And I would like to add also that we have to acknowledge that there is an immense zone of friction between curators or scholars as curators and curators as curators. And it could be a zone of friendship, but it's not always the case. So within the circuit of rivalries that exist within our understanding of curation and, let's say, a more straightforward exhibitionary understanding of curation, I think here we have to do almost another kind of etymological work. In German, the word bild means both picture and image, and I think we've been showing you pictures to a certain extent, an assemblage of pictures that the image that we are trying to arrive at is the critical image of thought. I think really the image that we are trying to think through here is there another kind of image of thought that is emerging through this work of curation? Is critique vanishing? Is there something else? So I think that's another dimension which is at work here. What is the fate of the critical image of thought, to put it in Deleuzian terms? As these iconic images have become dogmatic images of thought.
In a way, I think this might be related, but I'm actually really curious to hear you all talk about the space of these images, how you imagine them, even more so than the time of these images, because it was so fascinating fascinating for me to hear you recall some of these early film theorists, Gorky, and the way that to me, thinks about the sort of utopic potential that cinema would bring, and especially in relationship to a sort of mass audience and a public, and that the militant image is also about a kind of pedagogy and a kind of education. So, of course, we can all debate if the university, if the museum, if the cinema, if these are still places of knowledge production and of education, and you know, the complications there. But for this project to be in other spaces, what sort of parameters are you thinking about in terms of a public? Certainly there's different conventions of viewing, sitting down in a cinema, sitting down in a lecture hall, and being able to see these side-by-side images. And there's more of a sort of roving visitor, spectator in a gallery space or museum. And so the time comes back in of what sort of durational impulse do you feel like this project needs among these different examples that you have paired together. But again, just a little bit more thinking about as broad a public as possible and where that might intersect in this project.
So I'll let him answer the big ones in just a couple of minutes. I think that these kinds of images would probably be better suited for gallery space because they're on a loop. It's difficult to get a cinematic audience to come and watch things that are loop, first of all. We do know, though, from our friend at SF Mohan, one of the curators, he tells us that most pieces have about a 3-second span of attention of an audience. So we're sort of dealing with that. However, images and moving images in galleries tend to catch people's attention more often, and sometimes the moving image gets people obsessed with it and they'll wait out the whole time. So that's the sort of wager that we're placing on putting it in a gallery as opposed to a film theater. I don't think we're anywhere close to people like Jean-Luc Godard who can get everybody, who could pack the film theater and make you watch the way that he juxtaposes and superimposes and talks over things like that. So there's no illusion there. But we did think about it in terms of having a gallery space where we'd be able to use ceilings and floors and all walls, something like this, where you would simply project and juxtapose these kinds of images. One last footnote. The Lumiere believed that the cinema didn't have a future. And so this is sort of made on the concept of thinking about the lack of a future of a medium that was built on it not being able to establish itself. And so just to constantly think about what that no future of cinema always is, and embrace that no future as opposed to projecting.
I mean, briefly to answer your question, I think I personally make a distinction between film programming. I'm not a contemporary art curator. I have not curated installations, so I hadn't done it with, in the past I've been a film curator before becoming an anthropologist. So when I do program films in major art institutions, for example, we cannot have this kind of conversation. The resorting to academic language is not welcomed in, if you are in MoCA presenting the films of Raul Ruiz, who was perhaps one of the most sophisticated filmmakers, deeply immersed in philosophy and questions that we are debating today. So if you notice the kind of dynamic that takes place during those kind of traditional mode of curation, it's not conducive. So it's a vexing relationship that I have with some of these institutions. So I think, and Chris and I agree on this point, I think that the research, rigorous research, is a form of curation. And since the purloined letter in Lacan or the idea of difference in, for Deleuze, it's a question of theft. So there has been a theft. So if there is a purloined thing that's hidden in plain sight, it's curation. And we are all trying to grab a piece of it. Not from the art institutions specifically. It's just a modality or it's a mode that, but it cannot be a turn. If it becomes a turn, there is going to be an interesting book that's coming out soon called The Anthropologist as Curator. If it becomes a turn, it has already become a turn, and then we have a problem. So I think Chris would say that we are just turning without direction. And that's perhaps one way of answering your question.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm a curator.
Well, I'm expecting.
And not a scholar. So I don't really have a question. I just want to comment on a few things that I've heard since I got into the room. I think, first of all, you responded to the question as to can anyone do this? And you say basically yes. I would argue that no. Because I think it is very, curation, a curatorial practice of curating is very much about authorship also. It's very much about position. It's very much about perspective, and it's very much about personal perception and knowledge. And we may use the same content even, but present it and place it totally differently. So the same set of images or pictures and films that may be made available to us will be presented differently by you, by her, and by me. So I think that this difference or this nuance is quite important and is very telling in the sense that I consider curating really very much as telling a story. And what is more and more talked to as the diplomatic term, which I call the nostalgic term, is really very much unearthing stories and images that did not really circulate much. One may be critical about this sort of reuse or representation or reach out to these, these bodies of images and material that is out there. But at the same time, when you look at non-Western political history or cultural history, how much of this has been circulated? People don't really know about it. So curators are very helpful to bring these stories forward, in contexts that make them maybe a little bit more accessible, or to a general or larger public than within the academic realms, and to bring it to a larger audience, so to speak. So I strongly believe, and when Pareki was saying you said rivalry. I wouldn't say rivalry between the curator and the scholar, because theory has totally occupied the curatorial field. Theory is very much at the basis of what we do. And of course, theoreticians or scholars use material differently and transmit it a little bit differently than what curators do. But curators rely so much on theory and scholarly material. So I would rather think of interdependency, so to speak, or penetration even, and I think this is where it becomes interesting in terms of what kind of curatorial stories can be unearthed and made available to the general audience.
So let me say one thing quickly, and then I'll let Kodak address the vexing curatorial, that issue, because he knows that world much more than I do. I wasn't referring to the practice of being a curator. I was referring to, can people actually put images together themselves? And they do all the time. I mean, you can look at YouTube and just see that people make mashups all the time that are somewhat critical of all the things that you're talking about. And they might have no idea about the history. And, you know, some of your curators might not have a great idea about the history either. That doesn't mean that they don't produce something that couldn't be potentially interesting for an audience. And the audience might actually get something out of it that you didn't intend. Hopefully, you know, that would be the best, right? That they get different things out of this. So that was my only point, is just that yes, I think that people can do this. Whether people think critically or not is a different question. And but I think they can, you know. So I'm sort of in that camp that yes, they can, but it's not that they do necessarily. I'll let him address the curatorial.
Yeah, maybe that's where maybe it's important where mediation is absolutely key, and I totally agree with you that the spaces where we use this theoretical and scholarly material are usually not necessarily conducive to kind of, you know, progressive and
Right.
mediation of
And that's, you know,
the
that's a
museums,
huge,
the galleries, and so on.
that's a huge political issue. If you think about that, it's not the same in other places in the world. Scholars have a different reputation and they have a closer relationship to media in other places in the world. In the United States, that is not the case. We have certain scholars, some of them that I'll put in quotations, that speak to the media all the time, and they're the only ones that do. So it isn't that, you know, we have a public discourse that's particularly interested in critique. We are interested in the, you know, the one-liner that's going to kind of insult somebody quickly. That is not about critique, and that's not what we're interested in at all. We are interested in something that's much slower and causes a kind of interruption in those, and the ability to read something like this and say, I know what that means. Right.
So in this sense, there is a distinction, I think. I think there is a distinction between the time or the temporality of the professional curator and I'm going to reduce the scale of my intervention from scholar to just anthropologist. Because that's a rivalry between art and anthropology that goes all the way to the 1920s and 30s. And I've already written about that. And I think what's interesting is, you know, picking up on Chris's point about slowness. We've been sitting with this material for 6 years, 5 years, and we're probably going to sit with it for another 2 years until our project becomes actualized, whether in the form of an exhibition, etc. So we are not going from one thing after another. And I think that's a major distinction. The sequence of encounters with material that needs, or matter that needs to be curated, is different. And it's not a hierarchical difference. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm just saying that the way we curate requires a time frame that is larger than the one that a professional curator has working in a museum. The exigencies of a museum director or curator are different than, and I am not idealizing academic life, trust me. I am just saying also that the idea of curation as a story, to answer your second part of the question, because you said that curating is about storytelling, and then you immediately added that it is about circulating non-Western stories. Did I get that correctly?
Well, I mean, it's from my perspective.
Okay.
Yes.
So for me, maybe non-European or non-Euro-American, the West, I don't understand what that means.
Non-Euro-American.
Yeah.
Very.
And even that we can debate what that means. But for me, having conducted fieldwork in Mexico, for me, Mexico is the West. From my perspective, Mexico is the Christian West, even if you want to complicate things even further. Of course, there's a complicated story of pre-Columbian and pre-Hispanic colonialism that has been addressed by most of my interlocutors. So this idea of curation as an attempt to circulate non-Western matter is problematic to begin with. I think the task of the curator, as I understand it, from the perspective of anthropology, is to inscribe curation as an operation within the history of anthropological concepts, such as bricolage, for example. and reinscribe and curate anthropology. See, curate the history of concepts in anthropology. So curating concepts is another kind of operation. Deleuze and Guattari in What is Philosophy, in that famous fifth chapter, they are curating philosophy. So we move from Avicenna, we move to Averroes, to Heidegger, to etc. It's that act of bringing these conceptual histories that to me is my understanding of what curation should be. I think on the contrary, curation is up for grabs.
Is what?
It's up for grabs. And it takes various forms depending on, I wouldn't say one's personal history, as you put it. I would say wherever one's curiosity takes us. I think it's a question of curiosity, curation.
I didn't mean one personal history.
Yeah.
I mean one personal perspective. We look
I
at
agree.
things from a personal standpoint.
There's an observer,
And
yes.
that standpoint is that guides us towards a material, towards a subject, that's how we look at it. And also, and that is key, I think, in terms of, telling the story. But I would be interested in hearing what you find problematic as in the idea of curating a storytelling.
Should we take other
Well,
questions?
let's take other questions and then.
Okay, I will get back to it.
This will come back again when Claudia gives the talk later in the afternoon, I'm sure. But
I'm looking at the idea of the two images that you're showing is very cinematic and photographic at the same time. Those things could be done easily, relatively, if you have the proper theory that you're working with. But I kept thinking about how would you operate this particular kind of critique in a still situation or in a museum situation. And I was thinking about, one, addressing an audience with some of your ideas which you feel that the audience will not be able to understand completely.
No, that's not what I meant.
Wait. But if you took someone like Fred Wilson, who is an American black artist, and you have him do what he has been doing in museums, which is to recontextualize and recurate a particular exhibit or body of exhibition, you're bringing in other cultural issues, you're assessing anthropology in a very large way.
A certain understanding of anthropology.
And a certain understanding. The museums originally were anthropological collections.
Ethnographic museum is not the only venue for anthropologists to practice curation.
So you could see that artists are doing some of what you're already talking about, and they have been doing it within museum collections already. Artists.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, and so I'm seeing it as a little bit more difficult to do in a set situation or a still situation, where it's more easily apprehended with the double images that you're talking about.
I think the artist as curator, I'm all for. Thomas Demand does it. I mean, there are many artists.
Yeah, I just use Fred Wilson as an example.
Yeah, so I think that that's another conversation we can have. I think that I think you're confirming the point that we've been trying to make, is that yes, artists as curators is a paradigm and a motif within the contemporary art world, which I think has been well established by now. The slight critique is curation the property of professional curators? No. But you might be surprised to see how that goes when you are, and I'm not talking about you, about this is based on field work, for curators.
But it also, I think there is something you're addressing, which is whether we call it a turn or an interest. There seems to be, for scholars of many disciplines, a kind of exhaustion of their own work as scholars, and so there has been kind of turn of so many scholars becoming curators. And it is true that it's just, different type, a different approach to curating, right? Because for many different reasons, but in part because of one's practice that has informed one's becoming a curator, and there's something about, the production of scholarship that strangely needs long periods of time to kind of gestate and produce a concept or think through something. But we are all globally living as scholars in the demand for speed to actually produce very fastly, right? Even though we need time. So I think there is actually a relationship between this kind of turning to curating as something that helps us deal with our interests in different times. That's one thing. But we're not seeing curators desperately wanting to become scholars. Because I think everyone knows that we want to take over, there is the modality of the curator, which has many different faces, has become something of deep interest and desire for the scholar. I think that's what's kind of interesting.
And
right?
but the theory that you're talking about, there is a kind of scholarly impulse there. Sorry.
In curating.
Yes, yes.
Oh, yes, of course. But I'm saying, but there isn't a move like I don't know that many curators that really want to become professors.
You
Or maybe they want to, but
It's a form of wisdom.
We have one question over here. Wow, thank you so much. And I love disagreement and discomfort. I want to bring up an example and see if I'm putting something together from so many great ideas. Just recently, just closed Sunday at SF MoMA, there was this exhibit on China, post-Tiananmen Square. They called it China's theater. So, and I'm from performing arts, particularly dance. And I'm always aware of, in a sense, the physical movement besides the cinematic movement of the rooms themselves. And I'm curious, can I apply some of these ideas, both narrative, because there really was a skewing, an American skewing of the Chinese narrative. Okay? But I'm curious if this idea of juxtapositioning, and you also talked about the technology, right? You were talking about the editing, the assemblage, the kind of cameras, all that. Can I take these tools and, in a sense, as someone passing through, as scholar, also art person, can I use these tools as I'm an audience going through your curation? So in other words, it becomes a kind of pedagogy, right, for entering art. At the same time, if it's well done, which I think parts of it particularly the performance art, because they smash things in the same room. They had this itching film next to Ai Weiwei's thing about taking clothes off, and you would never see those together. But the curator said this and faced them separately from each other, made us listen to sounds from one over the silence of the other. I felt like there was an anthropological curation of ideology of suppression and repression. But it was how it was curated. Wow, this is like how you're making me see these images, and that power of that juxtapositioning. Does how I'm thinking of this draw on the ideas that I heard from you?
Yes, to some degree. I mean, the idea of the juxtaposition is one in which you don't create a synthesis, where the one, you can bring the two together. So if it maintains that kind of tension, then that's what we were interested in, maintaining the kind of tension.
Yeah, over and over again, depending upon how you went through, right? And there were also, it used the museum, Guggenheim, and it mentioned how in the Guggenheim they couldn't show this, so we aren't either. So you had blank video screens. It was about animal rights and things, but I thought
Yeah,
it was
those were interesting, yes.
Yeah, which I thought, so then you have the museum curation idea of talking to each other, and I kind of enjoyed that tension as well.
Juxtaposition is I mean, to go back to the previous conversation,
Yeah.
see, to me, when you say juxtaposition, I have chapter 6 of Marcus and Fisher's Anthropology as Cultural Critique. See, I immediately think how I curate anthropology concepts. And that chapter is called Cross-Cultural Juxtaposition. This was 1985. Cross-cultural made a lot of sense in that particular moment. I would say juxtaposition to court, yes.
Okay,
So
and I
we-
would have Pasolini in mind.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Poetry.
To me, it's, if there is a, I don't want to plug my new book, but it's the idea of cogitation that for me curation is a form of
was reading
cogitation.
that.
And it's not just, it's a matter of doing bricolage, of assembling ideas, concepts, images, artworks. Currently working on the work of Adrian Piper, for example. That's not a moving image. I mean, she does moving image work. She's not a filmmaker. But she's a philosopher. She's written 2 incredible books on Hume and Kant. I'm interested in those kind of artists because they have a double vocation. They are both academics and an artist. It's my inclination. Yeah. Other inclination. This is a matter of almost, for lack of a better word, of taste. I am drawn to that. I am affected by those. There are other ways. So I think we should make a distinction between curation and curator, perhaps. I think we are not curators and we're doing curation. I think like that.
Okay, on that note, we're going to end this panel. And we have a 10-minute break. Please join me in thanking our panel.